Good evening. Thank you so very much for making it out here in the inclement weather. We really appreciate it. Again, my name is Pete Moore from Case Western Reserve University. I am part of a group of several universities, Kent State, Cleveland State, Oberlin College, Case Western, John Carroll, Baldwin Wallace, and Hathaway Brown. Faculty from all of these institutions has created an organization called the Northeast Ohio Consortium for Middle East Studies. And this year, with support from the Social Science Research Council and the Carnegie Foundation, we're hosting a series of public engagements and conversations with scholars and intellectuals who do work on the Middle East. And today and tomorrow, we're honored to have Professor Shireen Hafez, who's an assistant professor of women's studies at the University of California at Riverside. Professor Hafez has published 2 books. Her most recent is An Islam of Her Own, Reconsidering Religion and Secularization in Women's Islamic Movements. And we're very lucky to have a fascinating panel to have a roundtable discussion on the topic of women empowerment in religion, kind of a broad theme. And to assist Professor Hafez in this discussion, my colleague from the Department of Political Science, Karen Beckwith, will be the moderator. Karen is the Flora Stone Mather Professor of Political Science at Case. Before coming to CWRU, she was at the College of Worcester and earned her PhD from Syracuse University. Her interests focus on women in politics, both in the U.S. and in Europe. And she's the founding editor of a leading journal called Politics and Gender. Her most recent book is Women's Movements Facing the Reconfigured State. With Professors Beckwith and Hafez, we have 2 local individuals who represent religious communities, but are also active in community building and civic engagement here in Northeast Ohio. So Reverend Courtney Clay Jenkins serves as the pastor of the Euclid Avenue Congregational Church, United Church of Christ. She was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, yay, and is a 2004 graduate of Spielman College, also excellent, because I'm from Atlanta, where she received her Bachelor of Arts in English Literature. In 2008, Reverend Jenkins received her Master's of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary with a concentration in preaching and congregational ministry. And she's active in the greater Cleveland congregations, which hopefully we'll hear maybe a little bit more about this evening. And then finally, we have Rabbi Stacy Schlein, who is the Shabbaton director and oversees the social justice initiatives at the Temple Tifereth, Israel. She's also a native Clevelander. Rabbi Schlein graduated from Indiana University with a BA in journalism and sociology and a certificate in Jewish studies. She was ordained at the Hebrew University College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. And Rabbi Schlein is also involved in the Greater Cleveland Congregations, a nonpartisan coalition of faith communities and partner organizations in Cuyahoga County, working together to build power for social justice. And just one more announcement before we get to the panel. Our next speaker is historian Toby Jones from Rutgers University. And in preparation for Professor Jones's talks, we're going to be having a reading group at the Solon branch. We're going to be reading his book, Desert Kingdom, How Oil and Water Forged Modern Saudi Arabia. And our first meeting for the group will be at the Solon branch on Monday, December 12th at 7 p.m. So you can look for that both on the library's website as well as the Civic Commons website, which we have information in the back. Thank you again so much for coming, and I will turn the floor over to Professor Beckwith.
Thank you so much. Good evening. I want to again thank Professor Moore for inviting me to join this panel and to serve as its moderator, and I want to thank the Cuyahoga County Public Library System for this wonderful venue and for the opportunity to discuss women empowerment and religion. I was thinking to myself today, so why would we think that religion has anything to do with empowerment of women? It's often seen as an oppressive institution, a set of institutions, regardless of faith community, established primarily by men with very few exceptions, shaped to men's needs and interests, taking women's concerns not into account, Across the last 40 years, women have had to struggle to have positions of sanctified power within their religious communities. So we might think, well, what are we talking about of empowerment if it's only in negative terms? But as a political scientist, I thought to myself, well, let's just see what this looks like. And so, of course, I turned to the data, and I'm a big fan of empirical evidence. And so I made a little list of nations, top 5 nations, the most adherents of major religions. And I started with Islam because I happen to know that Islamic nations, not in the Middle East, have had a history of electing women as prime ministers and as presidents. So if you look at the big top 5, the country with the largest number, not necessarily percentage, of Islamic religious adherents is Pakistan. Twice the nation of Pakistan has had a female prime minister. Benazir Bhutto was the first female prime minister of a Muslim-majority country. This is a nation that has legislated reserved seats for women in parliament and in subnational offices. And it's a nation that has a state religion as well. So I thought this is pretty interesting. Let's turn to the next nation that has the second largest number of Islamic adherents, and that's India. Of course, we know that India had as its prime minister for many terms Indira Gandhi. Currently, Pratibha Patil is the president of India, a woman. Sonia Gandhi, who is the party leader of the Congress Party in India, could have been prime minister when her party first and recently under her leadership came into power several years ago. She chose not to be prime minister, although she certainly could have done so. India has gender quotas at the subnational level and no state religion. And so as I was looking through these, well, this is interesting to me. We can look at Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Turkey, all of which have had female prime ministers, and some of which have had presidents, and some have had more than one. If we turn to nations with the highest number of Jewish adherents, Israel wins that. Israel has had a female prime minister, missed having a female prime minister because Tzipi Livni, I never pronounce her name right, her party, the Kadima party, in the most recent elections won the largest number of seats but failed to win a majority, and the coalition government that was formed thereafter closed her out of power. Now, she was interviewed in the New York Times Magazine several months ago, and she said, I will be prime minister of Israel. And when she says that, I believe her. Israel has also had very temporarily a female head of state acting in 2007 as a replacement. And as we go through the highest number of Catholics, by the way, the United States is the nation with the second largest number of Jewish adherents. Female prime minister, well, we're not a parliamentary system or prime ministerial system, so no, we don't have a female prime minister. Do we have a female president? No, we don't. Has a major party ever nominated a woman for president? No, we have not. What's our record for electing women to Congress? Well, in the lower house, it just went backwards in 2010. We're not even at 18% in this country. And so when we think about religion and religious domination and secular states and religious states, my brief conclusion, I hope it's been brief enough, has been that religion seems to have no relationship to the empowerment of women. In nations that are highly religious with state religions, women often serve as prime ministers and presidents and are, in the most traditional mainstream terms, highly empowered. And other nations which are secular, which have a plethora of religions and strong secular background, no state religion, sometimes do, in fact, have female prime ministers. See, for example, France, where a woman has been prime minister and also just missed electing a woman as president in the previous election cycle. So having said all this, I will ask our panelists, so why would we think religion has anything to do with female empowerment, or are we looking in the wrong place?
Would you like to start, Andres?
Well, Shireen, let me turn to you. Let me drop this right in your lap. Everybody else can get ready.
You should stand with me, because as far as an anthropologist and as an anthropologist who's interested in religion and women's role in religious activism, I have to say that to begin with, I am one of those advocates who see religion as a discourse. And basically, as a discourse, religion can be used in any shape or form depending on the context. Just like secularism, which is also another kind of discourse that can be also used in a different way depending on the context, I believe that women can do well in either or badly in both. So we really have to examine and be very, very careful about the context in which women become actively involved in community organizing or political positions. And we also need to take into account history, the history of nations, the history of leadership in these nations, to see what shapes people's minds about leadership, and what the role that power plays in these ideologies around leadership. If these kind of societies view power to be masculine in terms, then it becomes very difficult to envision a woman as president. So as we have witnessed here in the United States, for example, in the recent election, that many Americans could not view a woman as president. And that is because presidency is defined in very strict male patriarchal terms. Other countries, this may not be the case. Political power may not always be defined in masculine terms. So again, to go back to your answer, I have no answer except that we have to look at the context. We have to understand history, and we have to understand the social values of the communities in order to understand exactly what challenges women have to face in order to assume positions of leadership.
I would chime in. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I think that from the place where I sit, which is as a Christian pastor, and looking particularly from my context being that of taking both the Old and New Testament into account, I think certainly what we find actually from Jesus is that he was constantly empowering women and constantly challenging the 12 disciples and those who had perceptions about women that they should be in the back, that they should be quiet, that they should be seen and not heard, and constantly was one who was allowing women to come to the foreground, allowing women to serve, and we can go into numerous examples, which I'm sure may come out tonight, if nothing else, of the woman. I've always been moved by the woman at the well, where after her encounter, he says, go back and tell people that which you've heard, and she brings people back. And so I think that certainly throughout the biblical understanding of Christ and who Christ was, that there was a constant empowerment of women and an encouragement of women. Now, we constantly tend to relate to Paul, women be quiet in the church. I think you have to take that into context. But I do think that what we find is that there are women who are empowered. Interestingly enough, I serve Euclid Avenue Congregational Church. I am the first African American pastor. I am the first female pastor, and I am the youngest pastor by about 17 to 20 years. And so I wear a lot of first hats in that place, and grateful to do so. So as a young woman who accepted her calling at a relatively young age, I am inclined to say that I have felt nurtured. There have been times when I have not. But when I read the Bible, and when I particularly put on the lens of James Cone with God of the Oppressed, that as a woman who has perhaps been oppressed by race, by gender, by age over a lifetime, that God is in fact calling me out and saying that there is room for me at the table. I realized as I traveled the world this summer that women clergy is a rarity. And that was not my experience. I grew up with lots of female pastors. I never knew that women could not be called to ministry. And so perhaps coming from the generation where I am, I'm 29 years old, it may be that I entered the world at a very different place. I often say God knew where I needed to be dropped at the right time, that my religion has nurtured me to say, it's okay. God has called you, let God use you, and there's room for you. That's my experience.
I want to come back to this issue of calling, but Rabbi Schlein, you came also to your congregation in a period when female rabbis were not unusual.
Right, and in fact, in my congregation, one of our associate rabbis has been there for over 20 years now, and she was one of the later end of the first generation and the very first female rabbi in this country. Also a native Clevelander, by the way, Sally Priesand. She grew up on the west side of Cleveland. She was ordained in 1972. So very similar to Courtney, for me, when I, especially going to school in New York, being in New York, going to LA, places like that, people had seen female rabbis, they have heard of that, but going to different places they may not have. Many people don't even know, even though Rabbi Haim has been here for well over 20 years, there's over 10 female rabbis in Cleveland right now. And some people just haven't had that exposure or that experience. And one of the things that I had mentioned earlier, that it used to be within Reform Judaism, the positions and the roles that people were striving for, that were seen as the most prestigious, were the large, massive congregations that were considered to be great sources of power. And after the time that women have come into these roles, some of that has changed, and different values have come into play. Different kinds of questions are being brought to the table, and people are saying, well, how does our family life fit in with what we're doing? And there's a lot more creative things that are happening. One of my very dear friends from rabbinical school is working with an arts program through Brandeis. And so he says, he always gets teased. People keep saying to him, when are you going to be a rabbi? And there's lots of people who are like that. And I would put myself in that category too. I run a family school of 29 families. We meet each week, and I work with them primarily, and then I also do the social justice. So I was on the pulpit for the high holidays, but I'm not on the pulpit all the time. But I'm very active and involved in speaking within the larger community. So in a lot of ways, and that's just one example of how it's changed the role of what a rabbi is, how a rabbi functions in the community, and really presents multiple models. Not only do you have an opportunity to see women in a lot of different contexts, but in different ways, and for people to wrap their minds around that, and for the doors to be open very wide.
So this suggests to me that there are ways in which politics empowers women in religion, as well as religion potentially empowering women. So I'm thinking about this generational transformation. I'm sufficiently old that when I was in graduate school in the previous millennium, there were not female ministers, there were not female rabbis. These were unimaginable when I was a girl, and they were not common or visible. And there was a whole struggle in the Episcopal Church, certainly in the Reformed communities and elsewhere, to give women access. And so it's very interesting to me. I want to get back to this issue of calling in part, and then I'll ask some other questions as well. But many gods called many women across centuries. And it's a very painful thing, I know from my own reading in political science, who have studied this, that the state cannot help you to get stature within your religion. And so it's your religion that has to accept you. And when God is calling you, and organized religion, your religion tells you that they will not hear your call. It's very painful for those people, and those people were primarily women. And so I'm interested in this notion then, so let me just put this out here. Changing attitudes in regard to women, an active feminist movement, examples from other churches. Are these the political waves that empowered women within religion, as well as women within religion using their religion to empower women?
I'll go last this time.
Okay.
I guess what comes to mind, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is the story of Sojourner Truth. So Sojourner Truth, being born into a time certainly where women are not affirmed in ministry, and no calling is, or no affirmation of that calling is extended to her. Two things come out of that, and I think she's a prime example of combining one's faith with one's political action. Number one is that she preached anyhow. And I guess me and some of my girlfriends have that that saying that sometimes we go into circles, we go into places where our calling is not affirmed. And so I use that term preach, but I want to use that in a very general term. That could be preach anyhow, serve anyhow. Sometimes the challenge becomes, and I've had to wrestle with this myself, that if we're going to take it there, only want to look for affirmation from, in most cases here, men of my calling, then is my trust in the one who called me, or is my trust in the men who have interpreted the Bible to understand what they mean. And so with Sojourner Truth as the example, as she began to fight for civil rights, she made it very clear that part of her role was the civil rights in race, but part of that also was women's rights. And to understand that women still had a voice and a responsibility. And I think that that's where sometimes we fall. I could spend my life fighting to be affirmed. And there's room for that, and there are women who are called to do that. At the same time, part of my role and responsibility is to feed those who are hungry, to clothe those who are naked, and to visit those who are in prison. And so the question ultimately becomes for me, do I fight or do I feed? And know that at the end, I've done what I felt called to do. I'm married to a Baptist pastor. So I pastor a UCC church, and 10 minutes away is my husband, who is a Baptist pastor, who's very affirming, obviously, of women in ministry, and who I am. But I guess I share that because people at his church have said to him, how do you deal with this wife who's a pastor? And certainly not in this traditional First Lady Baptist role, hat, and perception. And he has said what I have said to him. He shares probably more often than I do. My wife has felt that God has called her, and she'd rather die and find out that she was wrong than to spend her life being judged by men mostly, and sometimes women. And I need to say that. I don't know about in your context, but sometimes it is the women who challenge that more than the men do. And I think that sometimes we assume it is men, but it's really not. In most churches, sometimes it's actually the women. That it's worth a try, it's worth a shot. And we cannot live our lives waiting to be affirmed by other people, because then we give our power away. And God has called us right here and right now to do work, and we need to do that. So I don't know if that hit your question, but I tried.
And I think, and especially with the timing of when women were first ordained, and I think it was really difficult for that first generation. So there was so Sally Priestand was in that first class, and I think there was a level of acceptance because of what was going on with the feminist movement here in this country, and it made people question. And I just imagine what it was like for her sitting in the classes with the boys, and the professors called everybody, including Sally, the boys. But through the years, it became more and more accepted. And so much so, one of the things that I found fascinating my first year of school is that among my classmates, I ended up, my roommates and I we lived in the feminist house. So in Hebrew it was Beit Feminist, is what everyone called it, very elegant. But what was so curious to me is that half of my class was women, and the three of us were the most vocal feminists. And we talked about how important it was for us to be involved with the Women's Rabbinic Network. And the vast majority of my classmates were like, why? Male, female. Why? What is it? We're all rabbis. We're going to be rabbis. What does it matter? And I think some of that reflects how the role of women has changed over the years. I, too, have had similar experiences to Courtney. I also find that there are occasions where sometimes people will discuss my age, and I can't tell if it's because they think I'm really young or if they're more comfortable talking about that versus saying, "You're a woman rabbi?" So it seems more accepting to say, "You're so young." And I said, "Thank you." And that's one of the job benefits, though, because until you're about 80, you're a young rabbi. So unlimited youth. That'll be wonderful. But I also have had that question of how do you handle people who do or do not accept you. That happened quite a bit, even more so when I was working as a hospital chaplain and going into someone's room and sitting with them. I had a lot of more elderly individuals who just simply wasn't their experience. And this one gentleman was just so lovely about it. He said, I just can't accept women rabbis. And I said, I understand. He explained his experience and why he felt that way, and I could completely understand and respect where he came from. And I thought if he and I had conversations and continued talking, I think he'd be in a different place. but how that, that conversation happened about 5 years ago. And those kinds of conversations happen a lot less frequently now. So that's fascinating to see how that's changed.
I guess it's my turn. In my case, I don't represent Muslim women, nor am I involved in Islamic activism. However, in the last 10 years of my life, of my career as an anthropologist, I worked with women's Islamic organizations in a country called Egypt in the Middle East. And my biggest concern was to study women who engaged with Islam, a religion that is almost universally here in the West seen to be oppressive to women, and how these women are able to empower themselves in a religion that has this reputation of oppressing women. And if you want to argue with that point, we can. You just have to go to Google and take a look, put in Muslim women, and the images that will come out on your screen are horrendous. Muslim women are portrayed on Google or on the internet principally as women who are covered entirely in black, women who are imprisoned, others who look like they are suffering, they're behind bars, or they have tears running down their eyes. I mean, it's really quite graphic when you Google that image. In my experience in those 10 years, none of those images ever came across me. In fact, in all of my years of field work and all of the relationships that I've established with these activist women, I've come to know, women like Reverend Jenkins and Rabbi Schlein, who are basically women who are answering a call, women who see themselves in a position where they really have no choice but to work in order to build communities, work in order to protect their families, in order to change society in a way that is more embracing of Islamic tradition, the Islamic tradition that promotes peace and friendship and the ethics of the early Muslims in the peninsula, principles of generosity, tolerance, incredible, building bonds, and so on and so forth. Many of these women have dedicated years of their life working in villages, helping eradicate poverty, spreading, not only the word of Islam or Islamic teaching among women who really have no clue about their rights in Islamic tradition, but also trying to promote, ethics of the day-to-day, how to be a good person, how to interact with your neighbors, how to share what little you have with others who don't have. And so these women, it's very interesting for me, and in fact, it's a real honor for me to be with these two wonderful women here, three wonderful women, including you, because it's just amazing to see how women can, through religion, carve out a space for themselves. So not only do they empower the communities in which they live, but they also change people's perception about religious leadership. I mean, that I think is a very important point from what I see that the two of you represent, which is this notion that we need to change the way we think about leadership per se. We need to see that those who occupy the chair do not necessarily have to have masculine anatomy. That we basically can also understand that women who who have the calling, who have this fervor to be able to serve, can and do that quite successfully around the world in communities that enable them to do so. So obviously, being in a place that creates the opportunities for women to go through, that kind of a journey needs to be there. However, what women make of that journey is what is really important, what's changing perceptions of leadership around the world today.
Can I chime in on a bit about that? I think that part of it, too, is our responsibility to the little girls. I have to remember that all of the time. I pastor in an urban environment. The majority of the young girls who come into our congregation with where we are now have had no one go to college in their family. Don't think much beyond, depending on what age they're at, not really a career that would require education. And so every week, I make our young people shake my hand and look me in the eye, because that's what you have to do for a job interview. And once a month I ask them, where do you want to go to college? My hope is that, particularly for the little girls that are there, that not just my seeing me function, and I can already see the change in the little girls in our congregation, is starting to help them really believe that they can become whatever beyond rabbi, pastor, but to be in that place where maybe I really can be president. Maybe I really can be not just president of the United States, I can be president of Cleveland Clinic Hospital. I mean, really stretching the imagination. And so even that lack of affirmation, I press on so that those little girls can believe. I mean, I preached a sermon once at my husband's church, and this little 4-year-old runs up to me after, almost trips over her feet and says, "You preached a great sermon." That's the highlight of ministry for me. I'm serious, because a 4-year-old little girl, we had not been there long, who has grown up in a context where before my husband got there, most women were not affirmed in ministry, were not affirmed beyond a deaconess role, which is very different from a deacon role, of folding the cloth for communion, and sitting down. At that moment, something in that sermon, that little girl understood, not the subject matter, but that she could stand up, open up her mouth, and communicate something to change the world. And I think that is where the leadership aspect comes in. I don't lead like many of my male colleagues. I lead in probably a very different way. I've had a very different model by knowing other women pastors. And so I try very consciously to take that and translate that into the young girls who come into the church and ask them on a consistent basis, what do you want to be? I tell them now, your recommendation letter to college is already being written. Where do you want me to send it? There's 7. That's not the point. The point is, from a leadership and an empowerment perspective, helping them to understand that the God that we serve believes in you, created you to do something great and outstanding, and you can do it despite what others have said or the opinions of others in your class. And I just think that that's an important as it relates to the leadership component as well.
So I want to ask a slightly different question, and this is going to be a little bit of a rough segue, so bear with me while I shift gears, but not completely. So what Reverend Jenkins has been talking about has to do with presence, women being seen by girls. One of the things that happened at the beginning of the Arab Spring in the mass media was the question that began to float through the media and the feminist community: where are the women? And that's a fairly conventional question to ask. It's an important question to ask because visibility and presence and voice are important. And so then, that question was asked. And so, Shireen, Professor Hafez, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit and ask you to talk about that. And let me say, I think that's a fair question to ask, but it's not a fair question to ask if it's only asked of Egyptian women. It's a fair question to ask always. Where are the women? Why aren't they here? Are they here and you're hiding them? Are they here and they're in prison? Not nice. What can we say about this in regard to presence and visibility and voice?
The women formed on different days between 20 to 50% of protesters in Tahrir Square in Egypt during the 3-week protest or the 3-week uprising in the country. And perhaps this is a good opportunity for me to speak a little bit to the notion of context, understanding how the context is really important to empowering women. And that particular context, the context of the Egyptian uprising, was a wonderful opportunity for women to come out of their homes, many of them carrying their own children, with or without their husbands, from every walk of life. We're talking different classes, different religious backgrounds, different ethnic groups, different dispositions altogether. These women, marched next to their husbands, next to their countrymen, in Tahrir Square, carrying the Egyptian flag, wearing it on their faces, on their clothes, yelling, calling for Mubarak to step down, carrying signs that they had made at home, etc. So women were very visible. In fact, they were almost too visible. And the media concentrated primarily on women the first few days, principally because their notion of women in these countries is that these women are silent and oppressed. Every talk I gave, people said, we were astounded to see these women out of Tahrir. I mean, who could have thunk, You know, these women out there, you know, they're veiled, for goodness sake. You know, their hairs are covered. They're conservative women, and how come they're out there, you know, being so politically active? And, you know, I just can't help but just sigh. You know, this is what we've been saying for such a long time as experts on gender in the Middle East, that women in these countries are not these silent, passive, oppressed women who basically stay at home, cook, and take care of the kids and, you know, do all the mundane domestic stuff, which is not to belittle. Women are active. They are active in different spheres. They contribute to their communities in different ways. They may not necessarily contribute to their communities in ways that, say, Western feminists condone, right? But these women have and will always be part of any social uprising, any social endeavor that will take place in their countries in the Middle East, whether it's a Muslim, primarily Muslim community or Muslim country, or not primarily a Muslim country. Now, again, we have to look at the context. The fact that this was a nationalist uprising, this was an uprising that essentially was seizing back the country from a tyrannical despot, created the kind of context that enabled women to be out there on the streets, whether veiled or unveiled, in a country where women complain about being harassed. Maybe even up to 90% of Egyptian women normally complain of being harassed on the Egyptian streets in the last few years. This regular complaint was not once, used, or not a single woman complained of being harassed in Tahrir during the revolution. And this begs us to stop and think, well, how come, if women are out there on the streets, they're trying to be modest, they're trying to cover themselves, yet they're being harassed, but here in Tahrir, many of them are uncovered, they're even spending the night on the asphalt floor next to men, how come they're not harassed? So that kind of begs the question. And the answer is, of course, it's the context. The context of the uprising, the fact that many of these Egyptians were voicing their concern with a nationalist problem, that everybody has to, sort of band together and walk out in Tahrir as one single hand, as everybody kept saying, Eid Wahda, one hand in Tahrir. In that particular context, women have enormous amounts of clout. They have space to go out there, proclaim their patriotism, proclaim their support of the revolution. They're invited, they're encouraged, they're supported. They are an essential part of that revolution. Religious activism also provides almost the same kind of context, because religious contexts are almost seen to be easily accessible to women. Women, in fact, some of the attributes of a good woman is to be virtuous and pious. So in fact, in order to be active in religion, that's almost to be expected. That is, in fact, a field where women are also encouraged and welcome and embraced, right, in the religious context. So we see here patriotic revolution, where women are encouraged to participate, religion, where women are also encouraged to participate. Now, where are women then not encouraged to participate? Take a look at the Egyptian uprising now. After the uprising, we are months from the uprising. We are now preparing for elections for parliament in Egypt. Women are not encouraged to participate. In fact, women are now trying to work against the public sentiment in the political sphere in Egypt by reminding men of their role in the revolution, where they were most welcome. Harassment has gone back to its original levels, and women indeed are no longer welcome in the public sphere. In fact, SCAF, which is the military council that is now running the country, has already announced that women cannot be governors in the country, that the national quota for women participants in parliament has been eliminated, etc., among many other things. So this is what I mean by the context is really important for us to understand women's challenges and also women's roads to empowerment. Women are not taking this quietly. Women are organizing. They have recently re-established the EFU, the Egyptian Feminist Union, which was started by Huda Sha'rawi early on in the 1900s, which was the first Egyptian Feminist Union actually in the Middle East. And they have banded together They have called together all feminist organizations across the country. They have come together as one hand, Eid Wahda, this time a feminist hand, that is now making sure that women are going to be part of the new government that will take control of the country. So again, to go back to the Egyptian uprising, women are there, and they are doing politics, and it's not without its challenges, but hopefully they will succeed. So let's be optimistic.
Well, what I'd like to do now, almost, not quite, is to open this up to your questions. But before I do that, Rabbi Schlein, Jenkins, any comments you want to make before we subject ourselves to kind of invite questions?
Well, I would like to say how incredibly inspiring it was. I know we're far away, but to witness that and I think because of the constant coverage, to feel a part of that and to see really in a lot of ways shattering myths about women, especially women in Muslim countries, and to be able to be part of that experience. And I'm fascinated to hear how it moves forward, especially as the government is formed.
And I guess I would simply add that I guess from hearing that powerful explanation of context, it will make me think about younger women who were able for a time to be in the square and to protest, how that will resonate with them down the line. We cannot afford to judge history and time by one event. Everything is connected, and so it will make me wonder how, yes, those women are rising up now, as you said, and they are asking questions and they are pushing back, and the question will be down the line, what that will mean to women, what that will mean to others who see that and are able to make the connection and the link and say, we need to do that again, or we need to find a way that once we are able to obtain that which we are looking for, we are not pushed to the background, and how do we do that? And I'm sure that level of conversation and strategy comes about, but I think to be a part of that will ultimately birth something, if not in the generation who marched, in the generation who comes behind. So thank you.
Great. Well, does anyone have a question? I see someone's hand.
I was just wondering about the role of women in the Tahrir Square uprisings. If there wasn't so much harassment, then how do you explain what happened to Lara Logan, who was, stripped, and she believed she was going to be raped, and then was saved by the women? But I wonder what was going on there, some different dynamic.
I'm glad you asked that question, because what happened to Lara Logan was abominable, totally unaccepted. But it was an isolated case, and I can explain a little bit about Lara Logan. Not only represented her gender, but she was also representing foreign media. And at that time, pro-Mubarak thugs, Mubarak is the ex-president of Egypt, were actually being extremely violent towards journalists. And I think you might have heard also about other journalists who were attacked by quote-unquote thugs. That particular incident was unfortunately happened actually unfortunately principally because she was a woman, and she was a Western woman, and she represented Western media. And pro-Mubarak thugs had to put an end to Western journalists in Tahrir Square. And they chose that particular incident to do this to this woman as a vulnerable Western body in the middle of the throngs of people, because they wanted to make it reach the headlines in the West. And they wanted to make it into a public incident so that people would not identify with the revolution in Tahrir. That people would conflate what happened to Lara Logan with the principles of democracy and the ideals of equality and human rights that the majority of people were calling for in Tahrir. So people say, see, these are the Egyptians who are calling for liberty. Look what they did to this woman. think so. You can tell me, perhaps. Do you think they were?
I don't think so, but
Some people maybe.
I had a general question that I know the topic of this thing tonight is women and empowerment and women and religion. However, I was just wondering if the specific how women are increasingly becoming leaders in religious roles nowadays. But is it really religion that's causing empowerment in women, or is it just because society or the world in general is starting to accept women in powerful positions? And if that religion is just starting to catch up with the rest of the world? And I know I don't want to say that, correlation is causation. I hear that a lot in classes. I shouldn't assume that. So I want to know how you can prove one or the other. If it's religion that's helping empowerment in women, or if it's just something that's happening for other reasons. Does that make sense?
I guess for me, it is a combination of both. I think coming together at this time and in this place. I do believe if you look back with some level of open-mindedness, that you do see, as I said before, that Christ, for example, was affirming women in ministry, inviting them to serve, inviting them to engage. I do think, though, that has taken time. I do think that there are many things. I mean, if we use Christ from the place where I sit, Christ was constantly challenging society, constantly challenging the way things had always been done, and saying that we should not do them just because that's how we've always done it, the famous lines in the church. And so what I think you have now is we are, yes, on one hand, we're starting to catch up. We're starting to get it, but I think it comes together at just the right time. But I do think that we can look back that there have always been, it might be a woman, but a woman or some women who are willing to press the boundaries, which is what I think that my religion is about. That's for me what the kingdom of God means. It means to press the boundaries of that which is on the margin and say that there is room here. There's room, there's space, and that we can do this. And so all of those examples of those women who have been a soul by herself or has been a small group of women adds to the place where I sit now, and all of those things come together so that we might be able to turn the wheel a little bit more. So I think it's both working together.
And I'll just say, as a political scientist, I think that Reverend Jenkins is absolutely correct in this regard, but I'll put it in slightly more political terms. I think women seeking power with just ends that have to do with social justice often find in their religion, even if they don't believe, the tools to pick up to achieve social justice. And to be able to pick up those tools, which are very powerful in and of themselves, they can be destructive, but they're very powerful in and of themselves, allow women to justify things that might not otherwise be accepted. And so we were talking earlier, if you turn to your husband and say, God is calling me to help the poor and to help children and to help the ill, what husband can say, no, I don't, tell God you have to stay home tonight. That's a very powerful tool to pick up. And in many religions, all of the, I don't want to say tools again, but all of the liturgy, all of the sacred texts provide the foundation for doing exactly that. And at the same time, I think it works in the reverse direction as well, where people outside of religion say, we know your religion says this, look what you do to your adherents who are female. Is that right? Is that just? Is that what your God's really all about? And so that's another way for people outside religion, including working with, in fact, people inside that religion as well, can improve the status of women, especially, again, those who are called to their religion. If you're called by the God of your faith, and your religious structure prohibits you from answering that call. That's like being torn apart. So people outside religion can also help people inside religion achieve their goals. I find it very interesting to see how often women have used those liberatory tools that are part of their own religion for their self-liberation and then for the liberation of others.
Something you just said resonated with me. You said sometimes religion can kind of hold you back, but I'm thinking of culture and religion. You know, in the Middle East, there's a culture and then there's a religion. And I think being of both of those, I find it hard for myself to explain culturally who I am and religiously what I believe. And sometimes that's contradictory. You know, you try to explain, no, it's not right. In Islam doesn't say women have to walk behind the men, but then you see these snippets of, you know, Saudi Arabian women walking behind the men, and it's an Islamic country. So how do you approach that when culture and religion might be contradictory to them, you know, when that's a contradictory thing?
Well, culture and religion are seldom in contradiction. And that, again, I come back to, you know, my starting point about religion being a discourse. A discourse, a set of discourses, or a set of bodies of knowledge that respond to power structures in society. I'm good? Maybe it's too loud? Is it too loud? Okay. So Islam, for example, we can take that as an example. Reverend Jenkins was talking about early Christian women and how the biblical Jesus was very supportive of women and inclusive of them. Early Islam has very similar stories with the Prophet Muhammad, including women in decision making. Women played a very central role in early Islamic traditions. Basically, they were also considered to be well-respected authorities on religious interpretation, on keeping the Quran, which is the holy book of Muslims, you know, intact, on recording the traditions of early Islamic practices, and so on and so forth. They even took part in battles and led battles. So, I mean, you know, take that as an example of how women were included in Muslim society in its early inception. And then compare, for example, the example that you gave of women, you know, huddling behind their husbands or scurrying around, you know, in Saudi Arabia. So then, you know, how does this happen? How does this transformation happen to women, you know, from being, you know, included, from being treated in egalitarian way, because Islam is basically based on an egalitarian spirit. I mean, when you look at the work of Layla Ahmed, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but perhaps reading her book, Women and Gender in Islam, will help you a lot understand how this Islamic discourse has been shaped and reframed and doctored, and how interpretations have been, you know, sometimes used to support status quos and, you know, male power and sort of conservative views on gender relations across the history of Islamic traditions. So if you look at the work of Layla Ahmed, she argues, for example, that basically the interpretation of the Quranic text has been the purview of male interpreters ever since the inception of Islam. And the very period in which Islamic texts were compiled and interpreted, which was the Abbasid period, is the most misogynistic period in Islamic history. This very time when the Caliphate is Abbasid and the interpretation of the early Islamic texts are being recorded is a time when gender relations were unequal. So that has had a huge impact on the way, for example, Islamic verses are interpreted today. Women today have been engaged very actively in the reinterpretation of their faith. And perhaps, you know, you might want to read the work of Amina Wadud Mohsen, for example, who is an American Muslim, who writes about, you know, how women should claim Islam and reinterpret the verses in a way that is equitable. Layla Ahmed does the same in her book. So you could also draw upon both works to see how you can separate the discourse from the power traditions. Because the interpretations of these verses are subject to many factors. And again, we come back to the context. So of course, religion and culture go hand in hand. And it's very difficult, even in the Muslim world itself, for people to separate what they have been doing traditionally from what they believe is religious. And again, you have to go back to the spirit of the faith itself, the fact that it is an egalitarian religion, that it does not differentiate between people of different classes or races or ethnic groups, that it is embracing of all diversity. To see that the spirit itself, treats people equally, so how come, gender relations are so unequal?
Okay, my question is for Shireen. You said that women from different religious backgrounds and from different classes marched in Tahrir Square.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me? Yeah. And what do you make of the attack of the Coptic Church? How can women bridge that gap? And how can they claim Yad Wahida? How can they achieve a social justice?
Do you mean the incident that happened, the massacre of 27 Coptic Egyptians in front of the television building? That, to me, marked almost like a black, or maybe shed like a black veil over the entire revolution. This was I can't even describe to you, the feeling of incredible horror that Egyptians felt at that time, because like I said, this notion of Eid Wahda being one hand, the cross and the crescent, both representative of both religions, the Quran and the Bible together. People, recorded their faces and their voices saying, we are Christians and Muslims hand in hand. And then, what happened in front of the television building, where 27 Coptic, armless, the army claims that they were armed, but, I would claim otherwise, that these people were unarmed, that they were in a peaceful protest, calling for equal rights. And then what happened was, totally unaccepted. But that did not happen between the people themselves. This happened between the organization that is in charge of the country and the Coptic Egyptians. And I shouldn't just say Coptic Egyptians, I should say that this was an act of violence against all Egyptians, because it defied all of the bonds that were forged between every walk of life in Tahrir Square. And it was a moment, the next 3 days in the processions that marched against the SCAF, in the funerary processions that just took place in Egypt, Muslims were an equal part of that, and they made it a point to be present there. The Muslim Brotherhood issued a statement that basically rejected what happened and denounced SCAF for attacking these armless civilians. So I don't see that incident just as an incident that targeted Coptic Egyptians. I see it as an incident that targeted all Egyptians. I think that, in fact, it might, however, the horror of the event was, I think that it might actually bring even people closer together than they ever were. Hopefully.
We have time for one more question.
This should be pretty quick, actually. Basically, my question boils down to, are there opportunities for empowerment that women, in all of your experiences, aren't seizing?
I'll just say very briefly, I don't know a great deal about this, but in terms of religion, it's hard to imagine a religion in which women have not been active in trying to assert themselves as equals and get access to full faith and power within their institutions. So Women Religious, if I have the term right, has long been struggling within the Catholic Church. They've been struggling successfully enough so that almost every year the Pope, regardless of who he happens to be, has to say, no women priests. And he has to say it over and over again in a way he didn't used to have to, because women have long been struggling there. Some of those struggles are not evident. They're not very visible, and they're internal. And in the United States, as in some other countries, one can't use the state to gain equality within your religion. The state does not involve itself in matters of religion, and that's a long, constitutionally undergirded relationship in the United States that's been supported by a plethora of court cases. Another place that women have been struggling that we haven't talked about, which is not a religious institution, but I've been thinking a lot in regard to our discussion of Egypt, is the absence of women in the military. And women have been struggling for a long time in the United States to get access to positions of power in the military. Some of this is surely economic. You can support a family. You can have health care. You can have an education that the state helps you pay for. And it's been a wonderful source of empowerment for women at the lowest levels, and women once in the military have sought to get equality in the military. And in the military in the US, that's a state institution, and so all of the state legislation that has to do with equality, even if it doesn't apply, even if the military is exempted, the legal groundwork is there. And women in the military, Dakowitz is, I won't remember all the initials in that particular heading, but organized women in the military have been responsible for the extension of women being involved in combat with combat pay, a wide variety of empowerment now. I'll be interested to see what impact that has. We know that, although it's not been recent, military service in the United States is related to access to political power. It's valorized, it's privileged. To the extent that women are excluded from that, it means that women don't have that in their package to put forward when they run for president, for example. And I wonder the extent to which Egypt wouldn't be facing a pleasanter future if the military were not all men, hadn't been all male forever, hadn't been completely intertwined with the governing apparatus. I'm not saying that women are better than men, smarter than men, more just than men. But it would be interesting to give it a try to see what difference that might make. So in any case, that's a long way of saying that at this point, I can't imagine where women haven't been struggling in this country and in most major religions.
One of the things that I've been noticing lately and trying to pay attention to is where women are exerting themselves, the ways they're going about it, and how we value it, or how we celebrate it. And that's, to me, that's the piece that's missing. I was recently talking to one of my congregants who is this lovely woman. She's in her 80s. And, you know, I just see her volunteering at the congregation, and she always comes in with this beautiful smile. And I really didn't know her story, so I was asking her some questions. And it turns out that when she had children, she secretly went to school. She got a graduate degree, became a professor, and she was secretly working. Nobody knew. This was before women were really out there in the workforce. And you know, and I was just amazed as she's telling me this story. And I know that she's not the only person like that. And how are we fostering opportunities to hear people's stories when they're doing those kinds of things, and as a community valuing it and appreciating it, instead of more traditional settings and means that we go about doing it. And I think that some of that is really asking the questions and reinforcing, just as you were saying earlier, asking your students, you know, where are you going to college? I already have the reference written, what's it going to be? So rethinking different opportunities to celebrate the types of things that women are doing in the ways that they do it best.
I guess I would push back a bit on that, and I would need to take that with a combination of the previous question and yours. The church I pastor is multicultural, multiracial. However, in the what is traditionally known as the black church, I do think that there are areas where women are not taking initiative for leadership, and I need to probably say that as an honest answer. There was an article written by Dr. Claudette Copeland some time ago. She's a pastor out of Texas that wrote that the reason in the context of the African American church why most do not affirm women in ministry has absolutely nothing to do with biblical interpretation. And I have colleagues who do not believe in women in ministry, and it has absolutely nothing to do with biblical interpretation. It has everything to do with the fact that from a historical standpoint, going all the way back to the time of slavery, of men being emasculated, being treated as animals, and the space of pastoral leadership being the only, quote, safe space for African American men. that out in society, out in slavery, out in the fields, going down into Jim Crow, going into civil rights, that the constant struggle for African American men, that one safe space has been the pulpit. And so, therefore, women have taken a back seat. Understanding what they believe the masculine role, the male role is of men to be in society, to provide for their families, and so on and so forth. And so that if society is beating them up, we ought not come into the church and do the very same thing. And so that's why I said earlier, in some churches, it is the women who give you more difficulty, because I am, in theory, occupying a space that should be reserved for African American men. And so with that, when you take that piece into context, there are women that are not pursuing roles of leadership, not just in the church. And I recently learned about a church here in Cleveland that, again, had that same mentality of allowing men to lead, and therefore allowed no women to serve in leadership at all within the church. And ironically, these women were, and these were high-powered women in high-powered jobs outside of the church, that were totally fine with this level of service, of not understanding that we can serve equally. Some people don't grasp that I can be married to a pastor, not serving in his church, and still affirm his manhood and his masculinity, and we're okay with that. Some people cannot wrap their minds around it, that it must be either or, that it cannot be both and. And so I do think that in some contexts, and I don't think it's just African American, one could use that in certain Latina communities, where the man is to be the head and is to function in that way. I have a very good friend who's a rarity. She is a Puerto Rican pastor, and she's a rarity. So there are certain ones, but it goes much more to the social than it does to the theological. And I still think, in spite of that, it still takes women like ourselves to show that one can be happily married, one can affirm the masculinity of their husband, and yet still serve, and it be okay. So I kind of give that as an alternative to that answer.
Well, that's fantastic. That's hard to follow that up. And I want to thank the panelists for a fascinating discussion. And I want to thank you all for attending in our inclement weather. Please, we have some refreshments in the back. We have the room till 8:30, so if you'd like to ask the panelists some more questions or learn more about our program, we're here for you. Thank you again for coming.